Hi, thank you for joining us. Iran says it has opened the Strait of Hormuz, and President Trump says the regime is very close to making a deal.
Iran just declared the Strait of Hormuz open, and the President of the United States responded with the word "thank you" in capital letters. This is what the end of maximum pressure actually looks like. Every barrel of oil, every container ship, every naval calculation in the Indo-Pacific runs through this one choke point, and Iran just decided when to open it. Within minutes of Iran's announcement, President Trump posted on Truth Social, exact words, "Iran has just announced that the strait is fully open and ready for full passage. Thank you. Thank you." The same president who spent 48 days bombing Iran, who imposed a naval blockade with over 10,000 personnel and 16 warships, who threatened to destroy Iranian power grids, energy infrastructure, and remaining economic capacity, said, "Thank you." Over the next several minutes, I'm going to show you exactly why Iran was able to open the strait on its own terms, linked to Lebanon with conditions attached, with the American blockade still in place on Iranian ports, and why that outcome will be studied in war colleges and foreign ministries for decades. Now, here is what we know about what every major news channel is going to tell you today. Trump forced Iran's hand. Maximum pressure worked. The blockade succeeded. Victory is close. That narrative is factually incorrect. And demonstrating why it is incorrect requires understanding something structural, something China built over the last decade that Washington was not paying attention to. Let me start with the structural question that must be held in mind throughout this entire analysis.
Thank you for joining us. Iran says
why could Iran open
Hormuz
Hormuz today on its own terms?
President Trump says the regime is very close to making a deal. The president told Arweja Jang that Iran had agreed to virtually everything the U.S. was pushing for when the war started. That includes the removal of enriched uranium, which he says the U.S. will do in coordination with Iran, although an Iranian official later denied that. President Trump also said the regime had agreed to stop funding its militant proxy groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, and that the two sides will meet for talks this weekend. In the meantime, the U.S. is still imposing a naval blockade of Iranian ports. Here's what the president said about that today.
What will it take to end the blockade?
When the agreement is signed, the blockade ends. As soon as the agreement gets signed, that's when the blockade ends.
Throughout this entire analysis, why could Iran open Hormuz today on its own terms, linked to Lebanon, with conditions attached, on a coordinated route it controls, rather than on America's terms? America launched the most intensive bombing campaign in the Middle East since the Gulf War. America imposed a naval blockade. America threatened to destroy Iran's power grid and its remaining economic capacity. America said, exact words from the Pentagon podium, "You can't control anything." And yet today, Iran opened Hormuz when Iran chose to. Iran linked it to Lebanon. Iran made it a diplomatic gesture, not a military surrender. Iran said, "Thank you for the Lebanon ceasefire, and we will open the strait in kind." America said, "Thank you," in capital letters. That is not what maximum pressure is supposed to produce. Here is where this gets structural. The answer to why Iran retained strategic agency after 48 days of bombing is not found in Iranian military capability. It is found in an economic architecture that China built specifically around Iran over the course of a decade, an architecture whose components are what this entire situation turns on. The first component is the oil payment system. China has been purchasing Iranian oil in Chinese yuan, not dollars, since the early years of American sanctions. This bypasses the SWIFT financial network entirely. SWIFT is the system connecting global banks and enabling international dollar payments. American sanctions function by severing countries from SWIFT. No dollar access means no import payments, no military funding, no functional modern economy. Iran should have been cut off from global commerce years ago. It was not. Because China built a parallel system. Yuan flows from Chinese refineries directly into Iranian accounts through second-tier Chinese banks that carry zero exposure to American financial enforcement. America designed sanctions to cut Iran off from the dollar system. China built a yuan system and handed it to Iran. The second component is the dark fleet. China has been operating what analysts call the shadow fleet, tankers that physically disable their automatic identification systems, the GPS transponders that satellite tracking services depend on. These vessels sail invisibly. They conduct ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, moving Iranian crude onto vessels carrying different flags and different ownership structures before those vessels proceed to Chinese refineries. Now apply that to the numbers equation. China's customs records show zero imports from Iran since 2022. Zero. Yet China's recorded imports of Malaysian crude in 2025 reached 1.3 million barrels per day. Malaysia's entire oil production capacity does not reach that number. Not even close. Not even half. The oil was Iranian. The paperwork said Malaysian. And China's teapot refineries? independent refineries small enough to operate outside the major global financial system, absorbed every single barrel without question. America built sanctions designed to eliminate Iran's oil revenue. China built a logistics infrastructure that made those sanctions functionally meaningless on the ground. The third component is the strategic reserve. China entered this conflict with approximately 1.2 billion barrels of crude oil in strategic storage, built over 2 years by purchasing Iranian and Russian sanctioned oil at heavily discounted prices. When the Strait of Hormuz closed and Brent crude spiked past $120 a barrel, China did not panic. Its markets stayed stable, its refineries kept running, its factories kept producing. The IEA chief stood in front of cameras and stated that Europe had 6 weeks of jet fuel remaining. China had 4 months of supply cover sitting in warehouses. Most people assume that closing Hormuz creates symmetric economic pain, that the energy shock hits everyone equally and the country under siege feels it most. That is the entire theory behind the blockade. In reality, China had already pre-positioned 4 months of supply cover before the crisis began, meaning America's primary economic weapon, the energy shock, landed on Europe, on Asia, on global markets, on everyone except the country America needed it to land on. Quick, before we continue, thanks a lot for tuning in. Your support is what keeps this going, and I truly appreciate you watching. Please subscribe and like so I can keep bringing you these updates. So why does that matter right now? Because what China built is not a military alliance. It is not a defense pact. China never committed to defending Iran militarily. China never promised to fight America. What China built is something more durable and more difficult to counter than any weapons system. China built the economic plumbing that keeps a country alive when its enemies try to starve it. And then it ran that plumbing specifically for Iran for a decade before this crisis ever began. Here is the dimension nobody wants to calculate out loud. When the Chinese-owned tanker Rich Starry attempted to pass through the strait under a Malawian flag with a spoofed transponder and turned back after American warnings, China said nothing publicly. When China vetoed the UN Security Council resolution that would have authorized international force to open the strait, it did so in diplomatic language describing the blockade as dangerous and irresponsible. When Wang Yi contacted Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi and communicated that China was ready to support a resolution, that single diplomatic signal opened the door for Iran to frame the opening of the strait as a gesture of goodwill, rather than a military capitulation forced by 48 days of bombing. China did not fire a shot. China did not send a warship. China did not openly defy the American blockade. China simply operated quietly, below the threshold of direct military confrontation, and produced an outcome where Iran, a country that has been bombed for 7 weeks, whose central bank has warned it could take 12 years to rebuild, whose supreme leader and dozens of senior commanders have been lost, still opened the strait when Iran chose to, and on terms acceptable to Iran. Michael Kaufman, defense researcher at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, stated it plainly: resilience is built before the crisis, not during it. Iran's resilience was built by China, over a decade, before the first bomb fell. Most people assume this conflict follows the traditional logic of military campaigns, that sustained bombing and economic blockade must eventually produce either capitulation or collapse, because that is the historical pattern from every previous maximum pressure scenario. In reality, every case in modern history where American economic warfare did not produce the intended outcome. North Korea surviving 3 decades of sanctions, Venezuela surviving years of sanctions, Russia absorbing the most comprehensive sanction regime in modern history while continuing to fight a major war in Ukraine, shares a single common structural thread: China. China's alternative payment infrastructure. China's willingness to trade outside the dollar. China's strategic reserves. China's refusal to join American sanctions regimes. This is not an accident. This is a strategy constructed deliberately, consistently over decades, not as a military confrontation with the United States, but as an economic alternative to the American-dominated global financial system. There is a historical comparison that illuminates this precisely. In 1956, Britain and France launched a military operation to seize the Suez Canal after Egypt's President Nasser nationalized it. The operation was militarily successful. British and French forces were winning on the ground. Then the United States told Britain to stop, not through military force, but through economic pressure. America threatened to withhold support for the British pound. Britain's currency reserves were nearly exhausted. Faced with financial collapse rather than military defeat, Britain withdrew. France withdrew. Nasser kept the canal. That moment entered history as Britain's Suez, the moment when Britain discovered that military success means nothing if the economic architecture beneath you can be pulled away. At the press briefing on the day of Iran's announcement, Pentagon spokesperson Sabrina Singh asked directly whether the opening of the strait represented a strategic victory for American maximum pressure, told reporters, "The strait is open." That was the objective. The ground reality on the same day. Iran's opening was linked to a Lebanese ceasefire condition, a coordinated route Iran controls, and an American blockade still in place on Iranian ports. The objective America stated and the outcome America received are not the same document. There is a gap between what is being said at podiums and what is landing on the ground. That gap is widening every single day. What happened at the Strait of Hormuz is America's Suez. Not because America was defeated militarily, it was not, but because America's maximum pressure toolkit, the sanctions, the blockade, the financial warfare, the 48-day bombing campaign, encountered a counter-architecture that China had spent a decade building, and the counter-architecture held. Iran opened Hormuz when Iran chose to. America posted thank you in capital letters. That is what the survival infrastructure produces. Spain's prime minister stated it openly, on record. There is nobody else who can resolve this situation except China. That is not a news comment. That is a structural verdict on the new architecture of global power. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. America deployed 16 warships and 10,000 personnel to control it. And it still had to say thank you when Iran decided to open it. What just happened in the Strait of Hormuz is not only an Iran story, it is a live demonstration, watched by every government on Earth, that the American sanctions and blockade toolkit has a structural vulnerability. And that vulnerability is China. As long as China is willing to be the buyer of last resort for sanctioned exports, as long as China builds parallel payment infrastructure outside the dollar system, as long as China uses its UN Security Council veto to block international authorization of force, and as long as China sits on 1.2 billion barrels of strategic reserve that absorbs the energy shock American economic warfare is designed to create, the toolkit creates damage but does not create capitulation. The next country that enters a direct confrontation with American maximum pressure, and that has a deep economic relationship with China, will enter that confrontation knowing what the world just watched. That Iran, after 48 days of bombing, a naval blockade, the destruction of its military infrastructure, the death of its supreme leader and dozens of senior commanders, an economy that its own central bank says will take 12 years to rebuild, still opened the strait on its own terms, still linked the opening to a condition of its own choosing, still made it a gesture rather than a surrender, still retained the coordinated route, still left the American blockade on its own ports in American hands, and extracted a public thank you from the president who ordered the bombing. China will emerge from this conflict not with a military victory. China did not fire a shot, but with something more valuable and more durable than any military victory. China will emerge as the country the rest of the world goes to when it needs protection from American economic pressure. That is a structural position of global power that no aircraft carrier group can replicate and no sanctions package can undermine. The ceasefire expires in 4 days. The deal is not done. Iran still holds enriched uranium. The nuclear question is unresolved. America's blockade on Iranian ports remains in place. And yet Iran has already made the move that America spent 48 days trying to force on Iran's own timeline, attached to Iran's own condition, framed as Iran's own diplomatic gesture. From this position, Iran negotiates not from the posture of a defeated country. It negotiates from the posture of a country that demonstrated it could hold the world's most important energy choke point for 48 days, survive the most intensive American military campaign since the Gulf War, and open the strait when it chose rather than when it was demanded. That is an extraordinary negotiating position for a country that has been under sustained bombardment for 7 weeks. And the structural reason that position exists is a decade of quiet, patient, invisible Chinese economic architecture that America either did not see or chose not to take seriously. Iran opened the Strait of Hormuz when Iran chose to, not when America demanded. Trump responded in capital letters with the word "thank you." China's customs records show zero Iranian imports since 2022, yet China recorded 1.3 million barrels per day of Malaysian crude, more than double Malaysia's entire production capacity. China entered this conflict with 1.2 billion barrels in strategic reserve. The IEA reported Europe had 6 weeks of jet fuel. China had 4 months of cover. Wang Yi contacted Aragchi before the opening. Spain's prime minister said openly that only China can resolve this situation. The American blockade remains on Iranian ports. The ceasefire expires in 4 days, and the nuclear question is unresolved. Every one of those facts points to the same structural conclusion. China built the economic architecture. The architecture held. Iran retained strategic agency. America deployed maximum force and received a thank you note. Every empire eventually faces the moment when it discovers that the rules of the game changed while it was not paying attention. Rome discovered it in the Parthian Wars. Britain discovered it at Suez in 1956. America is discovering it today at the Strait of Hormuz. The question the world has to answer now is not whether Iran won or lost. It is what happens when a country spending $120 per barrel on oil shock warfare runs out of strategic patience before a country spending $40 per barrel on discounted sanctioned reserves runs out of economic oxygen. And the answer to that question is already visible in the single statistic that defines this entire conflict: 1.3 million barrels per day of oil that officially did not come from Iran, but obviously did. Do you think China has already built the same survival infrastructure for the next country that enters a confrontation with American maximum pressure? Let me know in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching. Subscribe and like if you want to stay updated. Click the video on screen to see another. I will see you soon.